This morning I have the privilege of introducing Pastor Sharad Yadav, who leads the church Bread and Wine here in Portland. Some of our alums, our students attend there. I've known Pastor Sharad for a couple years now. He's partnered with us in different ways at New Wineskins at the university, and just has a real deep thoughtfulness on contemporary issues. And I thought it'd be profound to have a pastor who has a concern for God's people's hearts to lead us toward this closing chapel address on God's comfort, God's pastoral care for us in the midst of dealing with the problem of evil and suffering. He's here with his wife, Evie. They have 3 children, originally from Idaho, pastoring there. And then 4 years ago or so, you came to Portland to pastor here at Bread and Wine. And so would you please welcome with me Pastor Sharad Yadav.
When Derek Peterson, who organized a lot of this event, asked me to be one of the speakers, I was obviously terrified. I'm horrifically unqualified to talk about this issue, apart from my physique, which I guess is a species, the problem of evil. But the topic is so personal and so twisted intellectually. It's like all this jammed together. The deepest philosophical problems and the deepest personal problems in one sort of package. It's an intimidating thing. I told him I think I'd probably rather just stand naked and stare at you for 40 minutes. It's not going to feel like that anyway. I said 40 minutes. I know it's only 30 minutes, but call your loved ones. It's probably going to be a while. Why even dare talk about an issue that is sort of one of those things that we should probably just put our hands over our mouths? I mean, it's so profound, and the suffering in this room is so profound. And of course, we learn to deal with it as though it's sort of normal, and we soldier on, and you would never know, looking at the faces, that even at your tender young age, before you've ever been to a prostate doctor, you have already probably encountered pretty severe suffering. So I think, this talk, a response to suffering, the response to evil. We should probably say that the first response is just silence, right? And I hope you do see that film. It's an important thing to say. I mean, I remember very young and fresh in ministry being called by somebody, this really stoic 40-year-old computer programmer, real robotic dude, and had issues in his marriage, knew about that for a long time, but saw this really stoic, really impenetrable person on the floor in a ball, just dissolving, just incoherently ugly weeping at the sort of sudden re-engagement with his childhood sexual abuse. What's the response to that? Let me tell you what the response to that is not. Hegel is probably not the response to that, right? You probably are not going to sort of start pontificating at that scene. And actually, probably Peter and Paul are not going to be any more helpful than Hegel or Kant. Because words at that point seem inappropriate. They are inappropriate. There is a sort of personal absorption. But this conference is called Live the Question, not Dodge the Question, right? At some point, speaking is necessary, right? What the weeks and months to come, something should probably be said. And the reverent silence can turn into a deafening, cruel silence, can't it? At the revelation of evil. So silence is probably the first response. Lament is probably the second one. I remember a woman, again early on, when I just avoided the phone. It's just like, let me preach the Bible, and then I will hide. I'll dig a hole in my backyard and hide in it. But I was unavoidably this woman wouldn't stop calling me. Her husband, wonderful guy, I think maybe even a graduate of here. Super studious, he's the kind of guy that would always just chat you up after the sermon. He would go long stretches of deep involvement and then just disappear from his family for days on end in some random seedy hotel, just drinking his liver out. So this woman and his wife called me and can you come help me look for him? What do we talk about in the car? We don't talk strategy, probably. How do we deal with it? Americans are very bent on what do we do? Because it makes us feel in control, and we like that a lot. So lament is probably the obvious second response. What you do is you grieve with somebody. But of course, that comes to an end too. Because lament without anything on the other end, without any response, is just despair. So, this is live the question, not be murdered by the question. So we have to respond. What's the response? What do we speak? We got to say something at some point. And so, with a lot of fear, we do speak. And of course, what we say is not an answer. It's a bit of a stupid analogy to this problem, right? It's a problem in really a metaphorical way. It's not a math problem. It's obviously much deeper than that. So answers, I'm not talking about answers. But we do have some response that's necessary. And there probably is no answer this side of the question. Kind of have to reconcile ourselves to that. Some things are mysteries. A word which I hate, actually. Pastors are awesome at dodging the question, not living the question. They're amazing at it. They're doing this because they can't sell cars. Sorry, that's some of you are studying for ministry, and I just insulted all of you, but I'm one of you, so I get to. We can dodge and duck and weave the question, but I think it's important to face it, but we face it like we face mysteries. Mysteries are not a dodge. It's not a duck. It's not trying to get out of it. A mystery is a question that we approach saying it is the journey of trying to grapple with it that transforms us as people, and that's the point, not necessarily to have the answer to the question. We have to engage, and there are things like this. If someone asked me the answer to this question, why do you love your wife? The answer is not, because she's 5'3". I can't give you some kind of attribute of her. She loves terrible butt rock. She loves Bon Jovi, you don't even know who that is. All of you are like, what is that? Is that Latin? No, it's not. But no answer is adequate to that question. It is a mystery. Why do I love her? It is a mystery. It's a deep and profound mystery. And it's asking the question, it's confronting the question, it's contemplating it that sends me deeper into my love for her, and that's the point of the question. Evil is like that. Evil's like that. So we have to respond. We have to grapple with this mystery. Am I stalling? Yeah, hell yeah, I'm stalling. But I think we could tackle it this way. And yes, these are 3 random P's that I picked. Get ready for disappointment. That's part of the problem of evil. You will be severely disappointed. This is what we tell our children every morning. Like, welcome to life. Disappointing, isn't it? But anyway, so just prepare for that. So here's more of that. Our response is 3 things, at least. Particularly those of you who are studying to be pastors, but listen, those of you who are not, and you actually bring these issues to pastors, accept nothing less than this. Okay? Which probably means you won't be going to our church, but I'm trying really hard, so give me a break. Prevenient, the response is a prevenient response. The response is a particular response. A pastoral response is a particular response. And it's also a priestly response. So whatever our response is, it's got to be prevenient, it's got to be very particular, and it's got to be priestly. So let me just explain what I mean by that. Firstly, pastors offer a prevenient response to evil. Prevenient meaning coming before. You can't really answer, like I said with this man crumpled on the floor, you can't come to this question with some ready fortune cookie phrase. You know that by now. You know it because people have given it to you and you've wanted to hit their face with your own head. And that's probably the right response. Like apples of gold in settings of silver is a word spoken in a timely moment. Well, let me tell you, in moments of deep confrontation with evil, it is not time to crack the case, Nancy Drew. It's not the time. A pastoral response is everything that comes before that confrontation. See, this suffering of evil is a kind of eye-opening experience. It's a kind of being hit in the face with the meaninglessness of suffering. That's really what evil is. Evil is, in the Christian tradition, a confrontation with a vacuum, with a nothingness, with a whole that is meaningless, purposeless. There's a senselessness to it. And that's what the experience of evil is. There's a book by Henry James called The Golden Bowl with the greatest name in all fiction, Fanny Assingham. Wonderful, yeah. Any literature majors? We write that down. That's beautiful. Fanny Assingham. She says she's trying to give an answer to what is evil. You know, she's kind of they're musing on it, and she says, I think it's the very, very, very wrong. That's probably evil. It's you know, the evil with a capital E, and that's a very modern response. Evil, a confrontation with evil, is a kind of being overwhelmed by something that's just so profoundly wrong, it's just stunning. There's just nothing to say. Because, you know, there are things that are less wrong than that. There's a kind of stubbing your toe, you know. But most of us, at least those of us who are not in deep need of medication, when we stub our toe, we don't fall to our knees. God, why? Where were you? That's mostly not what we do. It's only when we're overwhelmed with something that's like, well, how is this possible? What does this mean? You know, a school shooting, a diagnosis of a disease. I've been diagnosed with a disease called ankylosing spondylitis. It basically means that I'm 65 right now, when I should be in my prime. I have a sort of elderly arthritic condition that has me most days hunched over. I'm in constant pain, and it makes me less than delightful most of the time. And these sorts of things you're like, what is the point of that? That's an experience of evil. So in the Christian tradition, you know, there's these three, kind of riffing off Aristotle, there's these three aspects of what makes the world a transcendent portal into something bigger than the things we can see. It's goodness, truth, and beauty. And evil is a kind of parasite on goodness, truth, and beauty. In the face of goodness, it is a kind of bizarre twisting or vacuum of it. The neglect of a parent. Where there should be love, there's indifference. The kind of joy in a child at a school shooting, it's like, how could you conceive of somebody wanting to blow the brains out of a 4-year-old? You know, beauty is a kind of blissful order that transcends words. And evil is a kind of chaos, a kind of perversion, a kind of senseless distortion of what is beautiful. And of course, it is a vacuum of truth. It is a kind of distortion of the truth of things. And so here's, you know, what is our confrontation with evil? Here's what it is. Profound disorientation. And there's another word for that. Shelley Stearns, the theologian artist at the Seattle School of Psychology and Theology, this is what she calls trauma. You know, trauma is not suffering. Suffering is taking on board really negative, really disappointing, really painful experiences, but we can take suffering in the context of some story that makes sense. Trauma says, none of this makes sense. Trauma dissolves your story. Trauma is a kind of profound disorientation because even neuroscientifically, cognitively, it has no explanation. It defies any attempt to integrate it into our lives. And so evil is a kind of trauma. And of course, in the modern world, all suffering has become trauma. Because before the modern world, there was the Christian story. There was a way of understanding the world in terms of creation, fall, redemption, the work of God saying this world is essentially a good thing, and that evil, though it's a mystery, is being defeated by the love of God brought into this world through the suffering of Jesus, the identification of God with the suffering in his own nakedness before the world. So it locates suffering. But the modern world says we don't need that. There is no story. There's the story you make up in your own head, whatever you'd like it to be. That's the story of the world. And so all suffering has become trauma. And so this is why the pastoral response to evil is prevenient. It comes before suffering. Our job is to build a sense of meaning, to tell a story big enough to turn trauma back into suffering. It doesn't take the pain away. It doesn't make it any less horrific. What it does is it says this can be integrated into your life, and you can move forward in a story that still makes sense of the world. You know, Camus said, the greatest question any philosopher can ask is, should I have a cup of coffee or kill myself? And that's, yeah. I mean, today, obviously, the answer is have a cup of coffee. That's what today is about. It's National Coffee Day. But the question is really profound because he says, look, there's no meaning you don't make up on your own. So if you choose to continue living, it's kind of a defiance of the fact that we're all in a sense of trauma. So here's what I would say firstly, okay? The only way to turn trauma into, well, let's do it this way. The only way to handle evil is if it can become suffering and not trauma. The only way to turn trauma into suffering is to do all the work that comes before the moment of evil, so that a person confronting evil says, this is happening in a story that makes sense. And that brings us to our second point, which is a pastoral response to evil is particular. We do something as ministers that other people do not do. Now, I struggled with this for a long time because I'm Indian, okay? Which means I was 2 when my parents were like, Sharad, hi, how is your day? Good. If you don't get a PhD, we don't love you. So no pressure, but whatever, good luck. And that's how all Indians are raised, okay? And so because of that, I want to be a professional. I want to do something that finds a niche that I can prove myself in, And here's the crazy thing about being a pastor. We are professionals at nothing. At nothing. We're not therapists. We try to be, and we suck at it. We're not qualified mental health professionals. In fact, most of us are in dire need of mental health professionals. Okay? We're not mental health professionals. We're not philosophers. I might read a ton, but that's only because I'm made of cartilage and I don't like sports. I'm not a professional philosopher. I'm not Paul. I'm not a theologian. I read theologians. I have trading cards with their names, But I'm not, so I'm a huge fan, but I'm not one. I'm not one. So for a long time, I thought, well, being a pastor is just being a crappy version of all these other things? Is that what it means to be a pastor? To pretend to be all these other things who are really social workers on the front line of dealing with evil? Therapists on the front line of dealing with evil. Philosophers and theologians, they're the ones standing back at 40,000, sometimes 600 million light years above the problem of evil to try to crack the nut. What does this mean? So what do pastors contribute to that? Well, I just want to tell you, especially if you're studying for ministry, we do contribute something particular. And it's not by pretending to be one of those other things that we can be helpful. How do we build into a life the ability to absorb trauma, suffering, and evil without killing ourselves, without disintegrating? What is the work that we do? Well, I think we are the poets, the mystics, the contemplatives who try to channel for other people the rage, mourning, confusion, disorientation of evil. We channel it by speaking it so that people say, yes, that's my experience. But then we also have the job of building over time, from cradle to grave, building in a people a story that can withstand it, that can embrace it, that can make sense of it, our job is to build that story into the lives of human beings. So what are our tools for that trade? There are 3 tools, and we could talk about this for much longer. I'm already, you can tell, going to go over my time a little bit, so I'm sorry. Please have me back. Anyway, I just want you to like me. The 3 primary tools I would say is the gospel story. That is our primary. This is what we offer. Okay? We're maybe not in the nuts and bolts of saying, how do we help you respond to your sexual abuse? We can relate our own stories. We can even refer to really amazing, wonderful professional help on those topics. Well, what do? What we do is we tell a person, how do you locate that suffering and that evil within some larger story that can handle that profound disorientation? What's the story that can put its arms around that experience, can identify with it? It's the gospel story. It's a story of God's deep, deep love for the creation that wasn't just in the decision to make it in the past, ex nihilo, out of nothing. It wasn't that God, long time ago, flicked the domino to let the thing go. God, at every moment, sustains you in being as a conscious decision to hold you in His love. That's why you exist. And then, whatever the mystery of the origin of evil is, whatever has caused this to creep and seep and break God's world, God is so committed to overcoming it. He says, maybe you won't get a sort of deep equation-like answer to why it's come into this world, but I'll show you my commitment to dealing with it. I'll come into it myself. I'll let it murder, destroy me. I will hang before you, naked and destroyed, like you, to demonstrate with my skin in the game how committed to defeating evil I am. And of course, that's not just a tragic act of martyrdom, because there's a resurrection. There is a world coming where all eyes are wiped dry. We have to tell that story. Now, that's obviously the first tool we have. The second one maybe is a little bit more abstract. I don't know, you might not even agree with it, but you're wrong, and I have a microphone, so this proves that I'm right, actually. And that is a liturgy. Liturgy. The historic grammar of our community. You know, there's this big picture gospel story. This is where your life takes place. This is the answer to evil's attack on the truth. It's the gospel story. But the attack on beauty, the chaos, you know, the modern world is characterized by, we are the first people in the history of the world that wake up on a Monday and think we construct our week. But the liturgy, the church calendar, says your life takes place in the story, and to remind you of that, it gives you a grammar. It says the whole year is really about Jesus Christ. It starts in Advent, which is coming up. That's the beginning of it. God came into this world. It continues in Epiphany. God showed His light to the world in Jesus, to all the Gentiles, to all those who were far off. It continues in Lent, the suffering of the world God identified with in Jesus Christ. Your suffering, memento mori, you will die. But there's hope because there's a resurrection. Lent, the suffering of God, your suffering, the acknowledgement, the corporate lament. And then obviously Easter, 7 weeks, not one Sunday, of celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ and His conquering victory over all sin, death, and evil, over the grave. And then, of course, Pentecost, the coming of the Spirit, the movement of the church into the world to bring the life and the hope and the power of this story to bear on the world. And And all of these things shape not just your brain, but your week, your year, your life. The Christian calendar, I think it's important. This is your vocabulary. You know, Colin Gutton's a theologian I know that Paul's into. He likes him a lot. And Gutton says, we are always looking for the least inadequate language about God. What's theology? We're just trying to find the least stupid language about God. You know, the liturgy is a way of teaching us how to talk rightly about God. The creed this is how we talk about God. Every Sunday at our church, we say the Apostles' Creed. Well, why do we do that? Because we say, when you came in here, you might have thought that the world was a random, disorganized, swirling chaos, that are atoms crashing into each other, that things happen to you for no good reason, and you are just trying to hold on through your week to bear the storms of suffering. But the Creed says, no, this world was made on purpose by a creator that of all things visible and invisible. That the suffering of Jesus Christ was for the death of sin and evil in his own body. And that the church is a place where the forgiveness of sins and the work of the Holy Spirit says there is life in this suffering. We say it every week. You probably should too. Maybe just on your phone at home if your church doesn't do that. And of course the sacraments where we eat and drink God's love. This teaches us how to live in a story. It gives us the grammar for it. And I have a lot more to say, but I won't, mostly because I saw like 6 yawns going together at one time. So I'm trying to hurry, okay? I'm sweating in here. I'm so nervous still. So little love. Yeah, there we go. Someone smiled at me. Thank you. I can see all of your faces, is what I'm trying to say, okay? Anyway. So that's the third tool, and I'll just mention it briefly, communal practices. Communal practices. This is, you want to know what are our tools as pastors to help people respond to evil? Friendship. The word for evil, one of them is diabolos. It's from diabolane, to tear asunder. And evil is a kind of tearing asunder, which is why God's answer to evil is not a book, not even the book. It's a person, and it's a person who creates a community. God answered the question, what about evil, by giving the world a church. And that's not a trivial thing. I mean, when I first got my diagnosis, and was like, oh, you will live for the rest of your life in crippling pain. No big deal. There was a guy named Ken Anderson, graduate of this school. He had rheumatoid arthritis. He looked like a crumpled can. Just his arthritis was so severe. He was like a T-Rex. His arms couldn't leave this far from his body. He was the person who taught me that you could be in mind-numbing pain and smile at another person. And get outside yourself enough to actually enjoy what's happening in another person's life. And I didn't learn it from reading a book. I learned it from having lemonade on the porch with Ken Anderson. That's not a rational answer to the problem of evil, but that's not a non-rational answer either. There's no words involved that are exactly the answer, but the connection of friendship. There's somebody, when I was first hired at Bread and Wine, I was just telling them about myself. I mentioned my pain, and the woman I was talking to, her name's Laurel, started crying. And of course, I was just kind of offhandedly. And what I saw in her face was the face of God. And do I still have arthritis? Yeah. But it's a profound answer. It's a profound answer. Pascal, my patron saint, is that what you do? I'm not Catholic. And I know none of you are either. You should get to know one. They're pretty cool. But Pascal, he said, look, I know you can't believe in God. You look at the world and you say, it's so crappy, there's no way there could be a God. But what's frustrating is you look at it, and it's also too good to say that it's just meaninglessness. And that's why you are tortured. Because the scales they seem perfectly balanced. Seems like a good place and a really crappy place. So is there a God or not? He says there's no rational tiebreaker. Well, then how do I figure it out? Come to the Mass with me. He said, participate in the life of God's people, and that may not answer the question, but it puts your heart in a place where you can ask it in a way you can find what you're looking for. And it's a non-rational answer, but it will show you the deep and abiding rationality of this story that we live in, called the gospel of Jesus Christ. Do you guys all have to go to church? Are you required to do that? Highly recommended? Consider this a highly, highly, highly high recommendation. Be known. Be known. You wonder why, it's not an accident that people think there can't be a God because of suffering, and people die alone in their houses. We're so disconnected from each other, we have no way of accessing God's primary response to evil, which is the people you're sitting next to. Okay. And this, by the way, let me just make one other small point here. This is why when people ask, well, why could there be evil? If you think the answer to that is, don't worry. In some grand synthesis, some equation that we don't have access to now, God will give us the answer. Your child had to die. You had to get raped. Trust me, God knew that had to happen. That's not a Christian answer. It's not an adequate answer. Calvinists see me in a small room over there someplace. Super into Reformed theology, but yeah, let's talk about that later. Let's talk about it now for one more second. Sorry. I know you're like, oh, but I'm so hungry. I know, but just 1 second. Eastern Orthodox theologian, my favorite guy. His words are beautiful. He in person is kind of a jerk. But David Bentley Hart, he says, we Christians are not obliged, and perhaps not even allowed, to look on the devastation of that day of evil. To look upon the entire littered rim of the Admanon Sea and the Bengal and Upper Indian Ocean strewn with tens of thousands of corpses, a third of them children, and to attempt then to console ourselves or other people with some vacuous nonsense about the ultimate meaning and purpose residing in all that misery. Ours, after all, is a religion of salvation. Our faith is in a God who came to rescue his creation from the absurdity of sin, the emptiness and waste of death, the forces, whether calculating or malevolent or by chance, that shatter living souls. And so we are permitted, we are permitted to hate these things with a perfect hatred. And as for the comfort when we seek it, I can imagine none greater than the happy knowledge that when I see the death of a child, which you will see at some point in your life, I do not see the face of God. I see the face of his enemy, and he will be defeated. Okay. Promise this is quick in the end. So it's prevenient. It's particular. Pastors have a particular work, but it's also priestly. God. This is so obvious, but this is really honestly, this is what sets us apart religiously from the rest of the world. It really does. God sent not a book as his primary way of reaching out to human beings, saying, I would love to be your friends. He didn't send an answer. He didn't airdrop literature. He sent a person, right? Jesus Christ. And he sent not just a person, but a person whose whole life was suffering. It was his whole life. You know, in the Creed, how much is there to say about Jesus Christ? I would think a lot. What, you know, the Creed summarizes his whole life. He suffered under Pontius Pilate. That's how they said this is what his life was. So our response is a priestly response. It is to stand with one hand holding the hand of Jesus Christ, and with the other hand holding the hands of the suffering. And to bring them before him, and to bring him to them, which is painful work. Because Paul said, I bear in my body the marks of his suffering. So we don't just do it with our mouths, we do it as sufferers. If you can't see your pastor suffering, he's doing it wrong. And if you don't see it in a way that says, me too, then it's just narcissism. He's just feeling sorry for himself. A priestly response is a bridge. It's a bridge in a body. You know, I'm not a great preacher compared to what you could probably YouTube. But God sent me to Bread and Wine, and he's sending some of you to a group of people that he wants you to care for, because it's not enough to have a good speaker. There has to be a live human being who can know these people, who can surveil them on Facebook, who can desperately break and cry for them. It's priestly work. The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky states in the chapter of the Grand Inquisitor, this is the most powerful statement about evil. In fact, I won't even quote it because I can't read it out loud. It is horrific. It's Ivan, the atheist brother, talking to Alyosha, his priest brother, studying for the priesthood. And he lists all these horrible acts of evil and waits for Alyosha to give an answer, you know, just drops the mic, stands back. What do you have to say to that? So Alyosha stands up, and he walks over to his brother Ivan and cradles his face and kisses him. And that's his answer. And that's a profound answer. Because, you see, Ivan was saying, in this world that is so full of so much evil, it would have been better for God to not have made it at all. And Alyosha says, I'm sure glad he made you. I will accept the suffering of this world if it means I get to have you. That's a priestly response. That mediates the love of Jesus Christ. Bow your heads, and let me pray for us. I'm gonna read this quote by Dr. Aaron Calhoun. He is the head of pediatrics at the University of Louisville, which means he sees a lot of dead children. This is what he says, and we'll close with this. Christological answers deal with natural evil, not with a defense of who God is, but with an exposition of what God did. It stresses not logic and argument, but the power of Christ's death and resurrection over evil. We forget that the ultimate response to evil is not a theory, it's not a doctrine, it's a person. God is not in heaven as we suffer, benignly looking down on your struggles, holding back his divine power for some crazy, inscrutable, but probably good reason. No, he is here with us. His hands, pierced with iron spikes, have felt the weight of a dying universe. His heart, impaled by the point of a spear, was broken for the suffering we experience and the suffering we cause. The black sea of hatred, brutality, and sin that has engulfed the world was taken into his heart, the heart of the Godhead himself, only to be lost in the greater sea of his unfailing love. God, that is your response to evil. Thank you for Jesus Christ. Help us to respond like you do by first receiving this love with which you've greatly loved us. Open our hearts to take it in, we ask. In your name we pray. Amen.